Okay, so in this video I'm going to cover quite a lot. I've got the speeds increased, and we're just going to go through a lot of modeling and throwing in the last few manipulators that we have here. Hopefully this is useful just to see how the process is. I'm trying to record everything I do, even if I speed it up so that there's not any gaps, and all of a sudden I've got a whole section of airplane that's new and you don't see how that was created. So here you see I'm just animating the ignition key, and so that has multiple positions along with multiple values for each individual position, and so you just get that empty lined up and then rotate around its axis to set that animation. I also went ahead and animated these fuel transfer switches. They're just a simple up-down switch, and so it was fairly straightforward on how to animate those as well. And you can see there is, as I open up different layers, that each of my layers is again textured to a different color, and that just makes it really easy to differentiate which layer I'm looking at, as well as making sure that the objects on that specific layer are textured to the correct material so that there's no errors when I export. You'll now see I'm adding a couple standby instruments, and it's still fairly simple modeling. I added some loop cuts to that back piece of the bridge modifier from Loop Tools would link the two different shapes. And then here I'm modeling the airspeed needle. Now, if your cockpit is entirely physical gauges like this, if you don't have a screen such as on the G1000, then you don't even need to reference the panel texture. And as you'll see here on that airspeed indicator, that ends up just getting a standard texture, and then the needle is animated, and there's no it has no real reference at all to the 3D panel in PlaneMaker. You can entirely make that just 3D. On the standby altimeter and the standby horizon or attitude indicator, I kind of show a little cheat on that here, and it's something that people have been doing for a long time. It's not the correct method, but I wanted to show it, and so I actually model them and then map that center circle to the panel texture. So the bezel is 3D modeled, but then it's drawing on the panel texture so that I don't have to animate, like on that horizon, I don't have to animate a sphere and make it rotate in multiple directions and all of that. Now, obviously, the correct way to do this, which I will probably go back and do, is to actually physically model the insides of these instruments. But right here you see me mapping them to that panel texture, and it's certainly a quick way to get it in the sim and get yourself an instrument. But there's just a little bit of detail there that ends up being missing, and so many people will notice that it's just been mapped to the panel texture. So here you see I'm animating that airspeed needle, and then I jump into the sim to test things out, and you can see that those two standbys that I mapped to the panel are showing and working, but the textures are rotated, and so I'll have to go back in, and I think that's what I'm doing here is I go back in and pull up that texture so that I can get those rotated to the correct orientation. I also found that my animators over here were referencing the wrong data ref, and so I'm going back in and correcting that and applying the correct data ref and the correct values. Ultimately, the goal is everything that you would touch in the real airplane, you should be able to touch in the in your 3D cockpit, and so that's why you see I've got these yellow boxes, which are my manipulators, and I'm putting them on everything. I want every switch and every knob to be functional. I will also be doing that to the circuit breakers. Circuit breakers are a little bit trickier, depending on if the sim already has a working failure for what that circuit breaker reference is, or whether or not you need to kind of code in your own specific failure for those circuit breakers, but I will be adding manipulators to those as well. You see here I've now decided to jump into a little more just modeling again. I like to kind of jump around, mix it up a little bit. If you just spend all of your time on one particular item, at least for me, it gets a little boring. And so here I've jumped into modeling the dash piece. Now this is one item where I do use the subsurface modifier, and the reason I end up using that a little, and then I'll come back and delete a bunch of the extra geometry that it added, but this is something right in front of your face that you're going to be staring at all the time, and so you want those edges to be smooth. Now you see I've jumped into the exterior fuselage, and I've extruded that seam where the window is, and now I'm snapping using the magnet tool. I'm snapping those vertices to the interior fuselage piece to fill in that gap. That just otherwise you'll be seeing that gap in the sim, and so you want to fill in that gap, and the best way I found is using the magnet to snap to the nearest vertice or the nearest edge, so that you can cover up that gap that was created when we make two different pieces. So you'll see I've got the notepad pulled up, and that's because I had gotten an error on export. And if you pull up the notepad and open the X-plane log, it'll show you what you messed up, and it was just I had a particular object that didn't have the right material on it. That seems to be the most common issue that I have, is not having the correct material applied. And then here you see I've begun unwrapping my panel, I guess you could call it. And so I go through and unwrap each individual piece, and you'll see here I'm looking at that light blue that's going to green. That means that that texture is being stretched, and we definitely don't want any stretching. That makes texturing rather difficult. It also makes it just not look quite right. It's going to stretch your texture when you try and paint it on there, and so we want to eliminate any kind of stretch. And for some items, you can grab just the front faces and do a unwrap, which I think it's project from view, and that helps you get those flat faces, and then you just have to do a lot of seams and such to unwrap all your curves and edges and stuff like that. But you'll see here, so I'm going through, and as I get something unwrapped, I then hide it from view so that I know that when there's no longer anything in my view, I've got it all. And so I just go through and get everything unwrapped. And then you'll see here in just a minute, and I'll put a link in the description, but there's a little piece of code that I use to put all of these. So all of these UV maps need to be mapped to one texture, and Blender 2.79 doesn't naturally have that feature. I believe 2.8 now has that, which so you'll be able to unwrap multiple objects all onto the same texture without using a plugin or anything. But with 2.79, you need a plugin, which is the one I use is called Texture Atlas, and you'll see me use that here in just a second. And it basically creates a new model with all of your different objects merged together, and then you can lay it out, which is what you see me doing right here. So now I've got all of these different UVs everywhere, and we don't want that. And so here I'm separating everything so that I can now lay it all out on this one texture. Now when you get done with doing that, you'll need to eliminate the extra UV map, because using this Texture Atlas, it's created, you'll now have 2 UV maps for every object, and that will confuse X-Plane, that will confuse Substance Painter if you take it into Substance Painter to do your texturing, and so you need to eliminate that extra UV map. And there's a piece of code that does that. That's really simple and does it really fast for you, and I'll be sure to share that piece of code so that you can follow along. But you see here, I'm just trying to get everything laid out and fit, and I'm trying my very best to maximize the use of our texture space. We don't want any wasted space. And for example, right now on that texture, you can see a ton of wasted space inside those G1000s where the screens go. And we don't want that. We don't want wasted texture space. Texture space is expensive. It's one of the biggest killers of frame rate is when you have way too many textures. So we want to pack this stuff in as tight as we can. And so as you can see here, it takes a lot of tedious grab this, grab that, but in doing that, I am maximizing our texture space. And see, now I'm managing to fit pieces inside where those screens would go, and end up using a lot more of that texture space, and so don't leave a bunch of big gaps because it's just a waste. So right there, I was copying in my code and I pasted it down into the notepad area and tell it which UV map to delete, and then just run the script. And for all of the objects you have selected, it will delete that old UV map. And hopefully that's clear enough, but if not, maybe I'll make a slower video on how to go about deleting that extra UV map. So now you'll see I'm just going back through and I realized that I left out some small details. I had originally planned on doing those screws just with a bump map, but I decided that I wanted to properly model those screw heads in there just because it's right in front of your face, and I wanted it to look real. And then I've created some glass pieces that are going to cover these standby instruments, and so I was just making sure they fit and were scaled correctly. So here I ended up creating a second texture atlas. Something and changing my objects, something went funny, and so I had to create a new texture atlas. So you can usually, if you haven't modified anything, you can just reopen that texture atlas to adjust things if you need to, but I had to create an extra one for some reason, and then I went back and deleted the old one because, again, you only want one texture map. And then here I'm just going ahead and modeling a quick tablet to give us, some proper shape to the AviTab piece that we have in there. And then here I am finding a place to position that on our texture as well. And then there I'm using the code to delete the extra UV map that was created. Now here I'm going through and getting ready to bake the Ambient Occlusion Map. Now this is something that I like to do in Blender so that I have my own ambient occlusion map to play with on my textures after I get my textures created. And so that's what I'm doing here, is I'm trying to bake out a good ambient occlusion map. And I was trying to not have any weird shadows on my switches because they're already set in the panel, but they rotate. And so I hid the switches while I baked that ambient occlusion map so that I didn't get any weird shading on those from that. And then now I've gone ahead and I've started working on the interior. I'm now working on that interior door piece. And with that, you saw I just went around and snapped, so I extruded the edges and then snapped those vertices. And here on the inside of the window I'm doing it again. I'm snapping those vertices to the outside door piece, and that makes it so that you don't have any visible gaps or seams. And then here I'm just adding some bevels to create that interior door seal kind of shape that it has. So at this point I've decided to start fleshing out some of the interior. of the cockpit. Now, this is just going to be an object. I know it seems kind of silly to say that most of the cockpit that you model isn't actually your cockpit object. It's just an object, but this is just going to be another object added. I think I labeled it interior or something like that, but so I'm just going about, and now I'm getting I think I get the inside edge of this door all modeled, and then I'll continue on with more inside details. Again, you can see I'm using a lot of reference images. One thing to keep in mind when you're using them is they're not perfectly straight on, so don't try and match. As you can see here, I'm using that reference image, but I'm not trying to match it perfectly because it's not going to be a perfectly straight on image, and so things will look a little skew if you match your image perfectly and then you open it up in the sim. It's going to look a little bit off, so keep that in mind as you're using those reference images. One other thing to note is I got a little lazy, you could say, on some of my topology on some of these interior panels, and I don't remember if I showed it or not, but because I got kind of lazy and I didn't strictly stick to doing quads or keeping everything in with 4 faces or 4 edges, I mean. When I went to start texturing this stuff, the textures were turning out just horrible. There was a lot of, even though it seemed like I was able to UV unwrap it well, there was a lot of weird shading issues and glitches, and so I actually went back in and spent a lot of time fixing all of that topology and turning everything into squares, or at least into quads, and so just keep that in mind. It's worth it to focus on keeping everything quads from the beginning rather than having to go back and fix it later. A good example is this bag piece right here that I'm creating. Of course, on that you can see I went through and I fixed it right then when I created that bottom edge, but on that door panel piece I didn't go back through and fix that I had created that, and it just causes issues. Just try to always use quads so that when you get to your texturing phase, you're not fighting with those issues. So right there you saw I'm just running through and trying to UV unwrap some of that stuff. It's good practice to just try and unwrap your objects as you finish them rather than get a whole section done and then go back. It's just a bit more of a pain when you have to spend hours unwrapping instead of just spending a few minutes to unwrap one object at a time. And then here you see I'm snapping again that interior piece to the exterior piece to cover up those gaps. And now I'm creating that door sill section, I guess you could call it. Getting everything lined up properly with the door that I created, and then I'm going to add in a couple loop cuts and shape out that bit, and then I'll bevel some edges. Now on this particular aircraft, in the cockpit area, you can actually see some of the main frame structure, and so that's what I've begun modeling here, using a bunch of reference images that I have. I'm just going about creating all of the tubing structure that creates up this cockpit area. Now, one thing I did do is that first piece of tubing that I created, I unwrapped that. I UV unwrapped it right there at the beginning, and now everything, all of these tubing pieces after that are a duplicate of that first one, so everything has been unwrapped. Now they'll all be sharing the same UV space at this point, but they're at least unwrapped, so I can later go in and give them their own UV space, but I don't have to unwrap every individual piece. Now my plan is when I texture, so I'm just making sure that these pieces run into each other smoothly, and then when I texture, I will use a normal map or a bump map to create basically the weld seams that weld all of these pieces together. And so I just make sure that it looks clean right now, and in my texture I will go through and basically weld all of these pieces of tubing together. And so here I'm just creating some pieces. There are a couple pieces in the cockpit that are there to kind of cover some of that structure, and that's what I'm creating here is some of those pieces. Another thing I feel like I should probably point out real quick is getting your scale right. I may have already mentioned this, but constantly check your scale. If you have a measurement for a door frame opening, or for the size of a seat cushion, or the size of an instrument, always check your actual scale, because even if you feel like you've got everything scaled correctly, it can feel like it's right, and then you get it into the sim and it's too big or way too small or whatever, and then you'll come back and you'll pull up a measurement and you'll realize, oh, I was 30% off or something, and so just always check your scale so that things feel right. When flying on a 2D monitor, you can get away with being off a little bit, but I've recently acquired a VR headset so that I can make these aircraft VR compatible as well, and you definitely cannot get away with your scale being wrong in VR. Here I've begun to model the rudder pedals. In this aircraft, the rudder pedals are connected from the left side to the right side just on a tube, as you can see here, that passes through the center, and then I'm just creating the pedal piece itself. and then a simple duplicate of that, and then just modify the duplicate piece to kind of match the correct position for the opposite side that it's supposed to be on. And here I'm going about making the fuel selector. I feel like all of this is fairly simple, straightforward modeling, but I'll keep an eye on the comments section, either on YouTube or over at explain.org, and if there's something that I just brushed over too quickly, please leave a comment, and I will try to make a video or somehow explain the process a little bit better. Here I've begun to model the joystick, and I'm using a curve for that because it's a fairly smooth, curvy piece, and so using the Bezier curve just seems to be the easiest way to go about that. And then modeling the actual hand grip here. And on this grip I also end up using the subsurface modifier just to kind of help with that ergonomic shape that there is there. That just would have been too difficult, too time consuming to model that all by myself, so I let the subsurface modifier do a lot of that for me. I then still go back in afterwards, after applying that subsurf modifier, and delete a lot of those extra faces because it definitely adds a lot of unneeded geometry. So here's a point where I didn't have any specifics on the scale of this on that joystick, and so I had to go back in and rescale things because when comparing it to reference images, it was definitely too small. But I'll go back in and properly measure it and make sure that it's right as soon as I can find some correct measurements for it. Here I had noticed that when you open the door, I was missing a piece of this panel section, so if you open the door you could actually look behind the panel, which would look really awkward, and so I had to go back into that panel piece and fix that. And then now you'll see I've started on the seat cushions, and I'm actually not happy with how they've turned out, and I think I will probably go back and do something different. I was trying to keep the geometry as low as possible, and I think I tried to keep it a little too low, and so things ended up more blocky than I want, and the details and the shading just seems a little bit off. So I'm probably going to go back and redo these seat cushions, but this shows at least part of how I went about that. I think the only real big change I want to do is add a little bit more geometry so that it's not quite so blocky. Another thing is trying to find a good balance between geometry and just using your texture space. If you're using a program such as Substance Painter, which I realize is a little expensive for some folks, but I have a whole explanation that I don't need to go over right now on why it's worth it. But you can paint in your a lot of your smaller details. So right here I'm trying to add in some geometry for seat, like the sewing seams, which really isn't necessary. That's something I am going to take out, and I'll use my texture to paint in that normal detail. Now you don't actually need Substance Painter to do that. Substance Painter just makes it a lot easier to do that. You can certainly create your own normal maps. That's probably something I'm not going to show how to do, just because it's so time consuming, and that definitely is not worth my time to waste on trying to hand create normal maps. But if you can't create your normal maps, then you end up needing to create extra geometry, which is what you see here. I'm going to go back in and eliminate this extra geometry and just use a normal map to add those details. So here I've just gone through and I've deleted the bottom of those seats because you don't need them. You're never going to see the bottom, so why waste geometry, why waste texture space? They can just be deleted. I've now gone to the inside cockpit shell piece, and I'm trying to fill in that gap. If you remember on this model, that section is rather unique with the shape that it has, and so when I duplicated the exterior model to create the interior model, that section was just a hole, and so here I am filling in that section to make it smooth on the inside. Now I've also gone and I'm creating the skylight, I guess you could call it, that is on the roof of this aircraft, which is kind of a neat little feature. And so here I'm cutting it out of the exterior model, and then I've cut it out and I've extruded that section down, and now I'm on the interior of that shell, and I'm trying to make that geometry line up with the exterior bit that I cut out, and I'm going to now do the same thing and cut it out on the interior piece, and then I will again use the magnetic snapping to snap those vertices so that we don't have a seam there. And now I've moved on to the little vent that's in the sidewall here. There's a kind of an air vent for cabin heat, and so I'm just trying to model that into the sidewall as smoothly as possible. So here I've begun working on the inside door panel for the rear door, and I created that shape just using I made a plane and then I deleted 3 of the vertices, so I only had 1 vertice, and then I just extruded that vertice around on the shape I wanted. You'll see here there was another lazy moment where I snapped all those vertices to the center, which is a horrible idea, and it's going to create bad geometry, so don't follow that example. I went back through and cleaned that up, but here I'm just creating this door panel that has its little pouch in it. Now I had to apply the mirror on that interior shell, and I like to avoid applying a mirror until I absolutely have to, but at this point I absolutely had to, because that rear door, there's only one on the left side, and so I had to apply that mirror so that I could then create that door piece. But unless you absolutely have to, I suggest not applying your mirror until it's necessary. And then here I used a Boolean operation to cut out this kind of hole that exists here in the panel for the door handle. And as you can see, the geometry is terrible right there at the moment, and so the shading looks awful, which is something that I will go back and fix as well. And then just extruding out a single vertex to create this panel that then covers that handle area. So I went through and I snapped all those vertices to the door, and then I'm bringing in the other bits to create the thickness of that panel. So there you see I was just rotating that handle to make sure that my panel was not going to interfere with how the handle rotates. And then remembering to apply the correct material to all of my interior parts so that I don't get an error on export. And then here I begin working on trying to throw in a seat belt, which didn't go very smoothly, and I'm going to redo that, and you'll see here that I just kind of quit. But I'll go back through, and I think I'm going to use a Bezier curve to model that. But hopefully this was somewhat informative.